Hey guys, how is it going? Happy New Year. So bind points first. I think we have. Oh, hold on. There we go. So I think first bind points in 2021, right? So Roman with 1,000 bind points, then Humble Thinker with 500, and then Ben Diesel, who I think I haven't seen here yet. Um, 250. Is there any familiar relation to Van Diesel? If yes, that would be pretty sweet. But anyway, I thought, given that this is a brand new year, it's the first stream in 2021, we could set aside our differences and we could take a look at something that we can all agree, Christian and non-Christian, and we can just have a nice um, chat together about something really interesting. Um, so if you are anywhere on the spectrum, ranging from a Christian apologist, all the way to a Jesus mythicist, and of course everything in between, which I guess would include a non-Christian Jesus historicist, I think you might end up agreeing with what I have to say. Um, so you don't have to deny Christianity in order to find what I'm saying compelling. And I will explain to you how. You might be wondering, how is it the case that if the content of this stream actually reflects history, um, how is it the case that this doesn't lower our confidence in the core claims of Christianity being true? Well, I'll tell you, right? So today we are going to be talking about a specific academic paper, academic journal article, which is called Mark 15, 16 to 31, The Crucifixion Narrative and the Roman Triumph Procession. Where I'm going to put a link to that specific paper in the video description later. It was written by T.E. Schmidt, who is at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. So very liberal scholarship indeed, coming from a very liberal background, right? And it was published in 1995 in New Testament Studies. At it looks at the Gospel of Mark, and it specifically argues that various segments in of the crucifixion narrative in this specific section of the gospel invoke Roman triumph. The author argues that essentially various details included in Mark, chapter 15, verses 16 to 32, um, are essentially included by the author in order to create a kind of anti-triumph. And the point is to turn this seeming scandal of the crucifixion into an act of exaltation. And I mean, even if you are a Christian, you would obviously going to agree that the Gospel of Mark kind of contains dramatic irony, and it's just irony in general, right? So, for example, Roman soldiers putting a robe and a crown on Jesus and humiliating him as the king of the Jews, mocking him. Yeah, that's meant as a mockery, but obviously the author and his audience, who are already Christian, understand that the soldiers are actually right when they call him the king of the Jews, right? Even though the soldiers themselves don't recognize it. And the same goes for the titulus, the king of the Jews. That's also meant to be mocking. That's actually the crime that Jesus is condemned for, and by the Roman authorities, but not, you know, what the Roman soldiers and Pilate don't realize is that Jesus actually is the king of the Jews, right? So even if you are a Christian, you are going to recognize that there is this imagery in the Gospel of Mark going on. And what Schmidt is essentially arguing is that, look, we can uncover even more by looking at these particular details in the Gospels, which are very surprising if, this is the hypothesis is false. This is not what's actually going on. But they can be explained, their inclusion can be explained pretty well if this allusion to the triumph is actually the case, right? So if you are, for example, a Jesus mythicist, then, well, this is just case closed, right? That's another thing that we can throw out when we discuss, whether Jesus actually existed. Because look, here we have an author of the earliest extant gospels, um, essentially inventing a narrative, modeling the narrative after a Roman triumph in order to draw allusions to it. So there we go, right? That's just like one more reason to lower our confidence in the Gospels, specifically reflecting historical reality of Jesus' actual crucifixion, and the idea that there even was a historical Jesus in the first place, right? Because if this is invented, then why should we believe the Gospels when they say other things about Jesus, right? For a Jesus historicist who isn't a Christian like myself, this is also very interesting for various reasons, right? Or even though I think that the reason why, if there are allusions to the Roman triumph, the way how they are constructed in that particular way is better explained by the fact that there actually was a historical Jesus who really was crucified. So the author could only go that so far with constructing in an anti-triumph. He couldn't parallel certain elements of a triumph because that would actually conflict with the way how Jesus was really crucified. While if an author was inventing fiction completely, he would be much more flexible, and he could go much more further with these kinds of allusions and create a situation even more similar to a Roman triumph. And if you are a Christian, this is the most interesting question, obviously. What do you do with that, right? So here, Schmidt is essentially saying that the author of the gospel is making stuff up. He's creating a scene, a plausible scene, in order to make a point. He's trying to show that Jesus was being mocked as the king of Jews, but he actually was a king of the Jews, right? And his crucifixion, by drawing various parallels to Roman triumph, actually exalts Jesus, right? He goes through this process, and everyone around him thinks that he's being executed as a criminal. But actually, what they are doing without realizing it is they are exalting him by essentially um, recreating like a Roman triumph, right? So what do you do with that as a Christian? Well, you can agree with Schmidt that this is what's going on in the text, but you can just deny that this is made up by the author. You can still think that Jesus' crucifixion, this specific segment of the Passion narrative, was a Roman anti-triumph, and you can still maintain that this happened in history. How? Well, several ways, right? So first of all, some of the components of some of these illusions can be explained by the various participants, particularly the Roman soldiers, being consciously aware that they are creating an anti-triumph, and that they are mocking Jesus basically by um, casting him in the role of a triumphator, but actually like mocking him, right? That's going to work for some of the allusions, but not for all of them. Like there are some things that the author in the story, the characters in the story had no control over, so that explanation there wouldn't work. But it would work for some of the points. But you can go with even like if we can go basically explanation, and you can say, yeah, everything that is described in the Gospel of Mark happened in history. Yes, this particular segment of the passage is meant as a Roman anti-triumph. The characters in the story, the Roman soldiers, were not aware that they are recreating a Roman triumph, but it was just ordained by God in order to go this way, right? So essentially, it's God who decreed from before creation of the universe that the events are going to transpire this particular way because he wanted to create. It was actually him and not author of a fictitious story who wanted to draw this parallel, right? So on one explanation, it's an invention, a creation, literary creation of an author of a fictitious account, even though based on actual historical events. And in the different explanation is actually a creation of God, right, who preordained events in order to unfold this specific way. This explanation is completely available for Calvinists. It's not going to be that available for Arminians, but I'm sure they will be able to come up with something, right? Um, yeah. So just what exactly I'm talking about, right? So Schmidt essentially argues that there are various details in this specific segment of the Passion stories that appear completely incidental, and there isn't really any real, like, obvious reason for why the author invented them, right? And this is very significant because the Gospel of Mark, in general, tends to be very economic with narration. It tends to be very short, to the point, and there is not that many unnecessary details included, right? But suddenly, this comes to a screeching halt in chapter 15, specifically verse 16, right? So the author, who is normally very tight and everything is very like tightly worded and specific, suddenly starts mentioning a number of significant details. For example, Jesus was led to the praetorium. Um, the whole guard gathered. Um, there was a requisition of a bystander, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross. Uh, there is a particular translation of the word Golgotha. Jesus is offered wine mixed with myrrh, but he refuses to drink it. Uh, the specific timing of the crucifixion is given, which is something that doesn't appear anywhere else in the Gospels, right? Nowhere else does it say what specific hour something happened. For example, transfiguration, which is also very important, arguable, right? That's not specified. And a number of placement of criminals crucified with Jesus, who in the Gospel of Mark, interestingly enough, don't do and say anything. So they are the author of the Gospel of Mark just uh, making the point of mentioning that Jesus was crucified between two criminals is completely incidental and doesn't serve any purpose in the narrative. It's not setting up the criminals actually doing or saying anything. It's mentioned and then it's abandoned, right? And some of the details can be explained as allusions to the Old Testament. For example, Jesus being undressed. Um, and then there is the obvious allusion to Psalm 22, verse 18, which says that they divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots, which is of course what happens in the Gospel of Mark, right? But then you have all of the other details, and essentially the author is arguing that if on the hypothesis that this specific segment of the Passion narrative is modeled after a Roman triumph in order to drive this literary and theological point, then inclusion of these incidental details is expected and explicable, right? And the author, Schmidt, of the article, uh, agrees with scholars who think that the Gospel of Mark was written specifically in Rome. And he thinks that this raises the plausibility of his hypothesis because um, obviously if the audience was primarily Roman, or people in Rome, Christians living in Rome, right, then they would be more likely to get it. And it would be a more uh, successful literary strategy because there was a high likelihood that the audience would pick up on what the author is doing, right? Um, we can push that even further. We can maybe say that uh, we could identify a specific Roman triumph which inspired the author of the Gospel of Mark. That would be, of course, the triumph of Vespasian and Titus after the destruction of Jerusalem, I think in 71 CE, which is roughly when the Gospel of Mark is dated. But before we actually delve into it, we need to talk a little bit about what is a Roman triumph, right? So I'm sure you have some vague ideas. Maybe you saw it on TV or in some illustrations. Maybe you've seen the Arch of Titus in Rome, or the Column of Hadrian, which are two of the most prominent pieces of art that actually display Roman triumph. And apart from description in primary sources, they are the two most important sources for our understanding of what a triumph is, right? So what's a triumph and what's going on there? So Roman triumph is a festival which was organized after a successful military campaign, which essentially celebrated a triumphator who was a Roman politician, more specifically a military leader, during which he was essentially um, depicted in ritual as a god um, for one day. And um, it's very important to realize that this festival was a religious ritual, so it had very important political aspect, and scholars, when they discuss Roman triumphs, usually analyze their various political connotations. But it's very important to realize that it was a religious ritual. So it was as much a religious ritual as, for example, the Christian Mass is today, right? And this is something that people sometimes don't realize about various things in the ancient world. We couple of streams ago talked about Greek theater, and of course, if we compare current theater, contemporary theater with Greek theater, the biggest difference, arguably, is that when we go to the theater today, or I should say, like 2 years ago, before COVID, right? Um, this is just a completely secular experience. It's very profane, but actually, in ancient Greece, um, a theater performance was a part of a religious festival, and it was a religious rite, and it probably developed from specifically religious ritual. Um, Another very interesting example are gladiatorial games, which were, of course, again a part of a religious festival. It wasn't just entertainment. It was, of course, entertainment, but it was also honoring the gods. And gladiatorial game actually evolved from an Etruscan ritual of two soldiers killing themselves essentially in combat during funeral festivals, right? So when someone important died, there were various funeral rites which were performed, and one of them was this ritual combat when people died, and that was just part of it, right? If you ask me, that's I think that's a pretty cool tradition. So Roman triumph, similarly, was also a ritual that was adapted probably through Etruscans from the Greeks, and it was specifically developed from an epiphany calling for god Dionysus. Um, for example, in Athens, during one religious festival, Dionysus was costumed as a king, and he was carried into the city with together with a sacrificial bull. Um, this is very important because Dionysus was essentially a god who triumphs, particularly over men. Uh, and the procession and the entire festival culminated in a cry for an epiphany of the god. The bull was sacrificed, and the king appeared as Dionysus. And that was kind of the climax of the festival. And Romans obviously adopted it. They adopted all kinds of religious practices and mythology from surrounding nations, for example, from Etruscans or from the Greeks, but they always adopted it. They never just completely copied it 100%. They always made changes uh, so that the various rituals and traditions that they were copying suit their particular cultural sensibilities, right? So in Rome, Dionysus was replaced by Jupiter, and Zeus and Dionysus were anyway tightly linked together. For example, sacrificial bull was normally a sacrificial animal for Zeus or of Zeus, right? And obviously, a king was replaced by a victorious general. And the basic outline of this triumph was that soldiers proclaimed the military leader, the general, as a triumphator. Then the Senate decreed a triumph because Senate basically decreed religious festivals. The triumphator appeared wearing a robe of regal purple, which is the color was very important, and a crown. And since about mid second century BCE, it was actually a specific robe. So not just any robe, but it was a specific robe which was taken from the statue of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, where arguably the most important temple in Rome stood. Right. So in the temple, there was a statue of Jupiter that was normally clothed in this robe. And if there was a festival, this specific robe was used for the triumphator. And that again underlines this kind of temporary deification. For one day, the triumphator becomes a god. The face of the triumphator was actually painted red, which is really something interesting, right? If you, for example, watch movies that depict a triumph, I don't think this particular detail is going to be included very often. But apparently, the face of the triumphator was red, which imitated a specific a specific statue of Jupiter in the Capitoline Temple, because there the face was also red. I think it was due to the material from which the statue was made, but Roman or ancient sculptures in general were actually painted. When today we think about ancient, specifically Greco-Roman architecture and sculptures as having this pristine, clear, white marble aesthetic to them, right? But actually, if we could go back in time, let's say to Athens or to Rome, we would be very surprised and probably a bit disgusted by how colorful everything was. And this was even underlined by obviously the Mediterranean being very warm. So there is a lot of sunny days, and the hot, warm Mediterranean sun makes the colors shine even more. So, everything was very, very colorful. Okay, then the triumphator, after he made a stop at the Roman Forum when he sat on the rostra, which was like a specific tribune, walked to the Capitoline Hill. Normally, he was moving around in a chariot, but then he moved to the Capitoline Hill, and the culmination of the entire triumph was sacrifice of the sacrificial bull, and the crowd cried for an epiphany of the god. They called triumphe or triumphe, which is just a translation of a Greek word which was used during the festival of Dionysus, interestingly enough. And that again, that's how the triumph culminated. And the next day, when the triumphator woke up, he was no longer a god. He was even no longer imperator. He didn't have imperium, right? He was just a ordinary citizen, private citizen, and the spell, so to speak, was broken. And what's also interesting is that during the Principate, after the fall of the Republic, when empire was established, the triumph changed relatively quickly. First of all, from that point on, only the emperor could have undergone triumph, right? If you are running an empire, essentially an autocracy, the last thing you want to do is to enable competent military leaders. So the last thing that you want to do is to give them the right to perform a triumph, because that's just inviting trouble, right? That's inviting potential rebellion and potential civil war when these people will think, okay, I should be the emperor, not this guy, right? So from that point on, only the emperor could triumph. it lost its original function, so it was no longer a celebration of a military victory. Usually, it still was sometimes. For example, Claudius was awarded himself a triumph after he conquered Britain, much of Britain. But really, in the Principate, almost any circumstance could be used as an excuse for an emperor having a triumph, awarding himself the triumph, right? And more, the triumph kind of became a tool, a demonstration of emperor's own deification. So as we know in the Principate, various emperors became deified after their deaths, starting with Julius Caesar, then Augustus, Claudius, for example, Titus, Vespasian. I think that's it. I think Caligula, Nero, and Tiberius were not deified, if I'm not mistaken. But obviously, we know that like Nero and Caligula, in particular, probably flirted with the idea that they are divine while alive, right? So they would be either divine beings just by birth, or they would be incarnations of divine beings. Yeah. And what's really interesting is that various ancient authors outside the Gospel of Mark sometimes draw a parallel between humiliation of someone and them being a triumphator. So again, this raises the plausibility of this hypothesis that the specific segment of the Passion narrative in the Gospel of Mark is meant to be an anti-triumph, and that this was a literary intention of the author, because we are kind of seeing different ancient authors doing the same thing or similar thing. One example is, for example, Dio Cassius, who is a Roman historian, who, when he writes about how once powerful men fell from grace, he is essentially contrasting their state of misery at a given moment with how they underwent various aspects of Roman triumph in the past. I should have a quote here, so let's take a look at it. Okay, I think we need to go back. Couple of slides. Yeah. So this is Dio Cassius. He's talking about Sejanus. There are two examples, Sejanus and Vitellius. Vitellius was one of the three emperors in the year of the three emperors, which just happened to also be the summer of 69. When, after Nero killed himself, you had several people in rapid succession becoming emperors, and then ending with Vespasian, who managed to establish dynasty. So that's one example. And the second example is Sejanus. Sejanus was a military leader of the Praetorian Guard during the Rome of Caesar Tiberius, who, during his reign, who actually became extremely powerful. He concentrated the power of the Praetorian Guard, and he started scheming. He went so far as trying to get into the emperor's family, but then there was a conspiracy against him, and he essentially fell from grace, and he ended up being executed. So if you, for example, know I, Claudius, which is an amazing novel by Richard Graves, that's great. He's one of the characters in the story. And there is an amazing TV show, a TV series by BBC from 1970s, where essentially every prominent British actor of that period of time plays. So, for example, Claudius is played by Derek Jacobi. Caesar Augustus is played by Brian Blessed, who doesn't really fit the role at all. I don't really picture Augustus that way. Ian Hurt, who you know as the guy from Alien, who had the unfortunate pleasure of hosting the Alien, and he, for example, played in the dictator in V for Vendetta, or he played the titular in 1984 He plays Caligula, and all kinds of other famous British actors play there. But there, Sejanus is played by none other than Patrick Stewart, Captain Picard. Again, he doesn't fit the role at all, but still, it's interesting. But anyway, so Sejanus fell from grace, and when Dio Cassius is describing this process, he essentially contrasts his state of misery with how he used to be prominent in the past. He says, thereupon, one might have witnessed such a surprising proof of human frailty as to prevent one's ever again being puffed up with conceit. For the man, Sejanus, who at dawn they had escorted to the Senate Hall as a superior being, they were now dragging to prison as if no better than the worst. On him, whom they had previously thought worthy of many crowns, so here we even have the motif of a crown, they now lay bounds. Him who they were wont to protect as a master, they now guarded like a runaway slave, uncovering his head when he would fain cover it, for whom they had adorned with a purple bordered toga, they struck in the face. So again, we have this parallel of someone being struck in the case, or this, let's say, contrast with someone being clothed in a purple bordered toga, which again was a symbol of high social status, and that it being contrasting with being stricken in the face, and with whom they were wont to adorn and worship with sacrifices as a god. They were now leading to execution. The populace also assailed him, shouting many reproaches at him for the lives he had taken and many cheers for the homes he had cherished. So just to reiterate, here we have a different ancient author who is already using this interplay between mockery of a person, of a criminal, being taken to be executed, and this high exaltation. Sejanus never went through a triumph because he wasn't an emperor, but a lot of the same beats essentially are being hit. So yeah, and there is some interesting evidence that even in before the Gospel of Mark, specifically in the writings of Paul, Jesus was being perceived and being depicted as a triumphator. We of course have 2 Corinthians chapter 2 verses 14 and 15, where Paul says, "But thanks be to God, who in Christ always leads us in triumphal procession." That's pretty clear, right? And through us spreads in every place the fragrance that comes from knowing Him. For we are the aroma of Christ among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. Now, so obviously there seems to be like a shift of metaphor from a triumph to aroma, which may be very well the like an allusion to the Old Testament, and specifically to the aroma of a burnt sacrifice being pleasing to God, right? That's like a common atheist meme that Yahweh apparently likes the scent, the smell of a burning sacrifice. And I think, frankly, ancient Israelites probably imagined that that's the case because, you know, that's what we have in other ancient sources as well. So when we apply we apply the same standard to the Old Testament that we would to any other, ancient Near Eastern or ancient Greek, for example, text. Yeah, it seems to me that people just imagined gods as anthropomorphic beings, as beings that have palaces, courts filled with their servants, divine servants, of course, but servants nevertheless. For example, messengers or accusers who could maybe walk around garden with their two human or anthropomorphic feet, and who find various things pleasing, like a smell of a burnt offering. But it could be the case that this is actually an allusion to aromatic substances being present during a triumph. A little bit of a stretch, but an interesting possibility, right? And what's very important to emphasize before we go into the discussion of the various points that Schmidt is laying out, is that he says, look, guys, this is a cumulative case, right? So there are individual pieces of evidence, so individual components of the narrative in this specific segment of the gospel that he says vary in strength of credibility. So he basically says, look, in some cases it's more convincing that this is an allusion to a Roman triumph. In some cases it's not so convincing, and I agree. So in some cases, but what he says that the cumulative force of the comparison is significant, right? Which again, like if you are a non-Christian, shouldn't have a problem with cumulative cases, right? Like if when Christians say that their belief in God, or specifically, for example, in the resurrection is Jesus, is backed by a cumulative case, and that no single piece of evidence alone is sufficient to warrant that belief. There isn't anything wrong with that. Like this is how historians, for example, argue all the time. So here we have a New Testament scholar who just says, look, I have this hypothesis, and this hypothesis is supported by several different pieces of evidence, essentially. Those things that are more expected on my hypothesis than on alternatives. They, like individual pieces, vary in their strengths, and none of them alone is sufficient to warrant belief. But if you just pile all of them together on like a big pile, well, there you go. Then you have something, right? This is perfectly fine. And if you are a Christian, of course, you are going to resonate with this, right? So Christian apologists very often say that, look, Jesus appeared, fulfilled 300 prophecies. Sure, some of the prophecies in the Old Testament that are supposed to be pointing to Jesus are pretty weak. And, a Christian would be the first to admit that this is the case. But what's supposed to be doing the explanatory power, not the explanatory power, the persuasion, the persuasive power, is the fact that there is just so goddamn so many of them, right? Surely it can be a coincidence that a person in history would just hit 300 of these prophecies, or 400, or however many. And so that's kind of a similar logic. I agree, by the way. It's really improbable that just like a random person would hit all of these parallels with the Old Testament. But I think, human design, specifically a literary design of a human author, is just much more probable explanation than divine design, So let's go into the specific details. So let's start with the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verse 16, which of course says, then the soldiers led him to the courtyard of the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, of course in Greek, praetorion, and in Latin, praetorium. And they called together the whole cohort. So that would be a specific Roman military unit. Roman army, obviously very well organized. So the cohort was like a technical term for a specific number of soldiers in a legion. The exact number could vary depending on just the size of the unit, right? It wasn't always the full complement, but it's like an approximation, roughly 200 people at this point in time, right? And it's really odd in this point, Schmidt says, that the author of the Gospel of Mark would specifically translate the term and call attention to it by doing it. At face value, isn't really any reason for him to do this, and he doesn't really do that often in the Gospel of Mark. There are many more places where he, if he wanted to, could have done it, and he would have a reason to do it, but he doesn't. So Schmidt thinks that this is significant. And praetorium, of course, is a general term for military headquarters. It shows up elsewhere in the New Testament, for example, in Acts, and I think in one of the letters of Paul. But Schmidt essentially draws the attention, of course, to the Praetorian Guard, which was a very prominent military unit that would be present during a triumph. And this like early essentially indication, this detail early on could be an indication of the author to let his audience know what's going on, right? So when you have these in ancient literature, when you have authors employing these kinds of literary tools, what they do very often is they include some early clues to the audience. Okay, there's something going on right now. You need to pay attention, and you have to use your discernment in order to get what I'm trying to say, right? And it could be the case that him specifically mentioning the Praetorium, which is something that would maybe the Roman audience would immediately think, okay, a Roman triumph um, is one of these clues, right? And just historically speaking, it's really weird that they would, like the entire cohort would meet, right? That 200 people would meet to beat up one guy. That's something that you could do very well with a much smaller number of people, especially given that at the same time Passover is going on. You have crowds in Jerusalem. The Passover was very often I would say usually a very precarious situation. It was a situation of political and religious tension where the relationships between the Jewish population and the Roman population was very, I would say, there was a lot of anxiety essentially. It was also one of the few occasions during the year when Pilate would be present himself in Jerusalem together with Roman soldiers. They would be normally, with like a large detachment of Jewish Roman soldiers, they would be normally stationed in Caesarea, which was which had a much larger Gentile population, and it's where the governor of Judea normally resided during the year, right? So you already have this tension of Gentiles being present during arguably the most important Jewish festival, and basically anything could go wrong at any moment. There could be violence, and there very often was violence during the Passover. So the idea that the entire cohort would gather to just beat up this one guy, uh, it's not impossible, but I would say it's not like super plausible. You know, that would basically require Pilate, who didn't have that many soldiers at under his command. By the way, he had a couple of hundreds who would be brought to Jerusalem specifically in order to uh, arrange for security. Um, the idea that he would just recall all of them to beat up one guy, and that he would basically have to draw forces from providing security in the city and just making sure that there isn't any violence coming from the large number of people being gathered for a solar festival. Not super plausible. Again, not saying 100% Cartesian certainty didn't happen in history. Not saying I have a sound deductive syllogism, where the conclusion is that this didn't happen in history. I'm just saying, maybe uh, subtract a couple percentage points from your epistemic credence just based on that. Then we have verse 17, which says, "And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him." So here, I think the allusion to a Roman triumph is pretty straightforward. Wearing of purple was outlawed for people below the equestrial rank, and increasingly enough, a purple cloak was a specifically a sign or a symbol of the emperor. And this is true in late antiquity, where if someone found that you have a purple cloak in your home, well, that's just immediate execution, right? Because it means you must be a part of a conspiracy to proclaim a new emperor, because nobody else was allowed to wear a purple cloak. Here, not so much. But what's important is that purple cloak was exactly what was put on triumphator during a triumph, as was a crown. And also another crown was actually held by a slave above his head as he was riding a chariot. This is something that you could maybe saw, like in movies or TV shows, that the triumphator has like a crown, um, and then there is this one guy who holds up another crown above his head. And what's really significant is that, again, if we think that this happened in history, we would have to imagine that Pilate actually lended his own robe for the situation, because in Jerusalem at the time, he would be the only one who would have it, right? Yeah, Pilate was of equestrial rank, so he was allowed to wear it. But for example, his soldiers, who were mostly Gentile, wouldn't have it. So that's, again, would he lend his like precious clothing? Would he lend his precious clothing for this occasion to be like stricken and spat upon? Again, not 100% logically, metaphysically impossible, but I think we should again lower our epistemic credence at least a scotch. And what's interesting enough is that the author of the Gospel of Matthew, who of course had a copy of the Gospel of Mark open in front of him when he wrote, and this is what we have shown in previous streams, how we know that, maybe realized that this might be a problem, and he changed the color of the robe from purple to red. And there are different Greek expressions. I think there are studies on like semantic ranges of these terms for colors. This is something that's studied relatively heavily, relatively expensively. So purple, of course, porphyra, and red kokkinos, two different colors. And even Christian apologists recognize that they are different. And indeed, what was the color of the robe is one of the alleged contradictions that like answers in Genesis and every apologetic website that has this kind of content will have to deal with. How can they actually harmonize this contradiction? Well, of course they can, because you can harmonize any contradiction. In fact, I have a standing challenge to any theists. Provide a contradiction, apparent contradiction in some religion. You're probably going to go for a religion other than your own, but I will harmonize it using the same tools of harmonization that Christian apologists used for the Bible. And the point is that you can, of course, harmonize anything. And in this case, I've seen at least two different explanations. One is more hilarious than the other. So one of them is pretty straightforward. Jesus was actually clothed in two different robes. One was purple and the other one was red. And it just happened to be the case that Peter, who is, of course, the eyewitness source behind the Gospel of Mark, right, just forgot about the red robe. And Matthew, the author of the Gospel of Matthew, the apostle, tax collector from Galilee, just forgot about the purple robe, And actually, these are exactly the details that you would find in eyewitness testimony, right? So if when J. Warner Wallace separates the different eyewitnesses, they will tell him these. They will make these differences. They will change, like their testimony is going to have these differences, discrepancies, right? That's how you know that this is in fact eyewitness testimony. Yeah, so that's one harmonization. The second harmonization is that either one or both or multiple, actually, because the robe is mentioned elsewhere as well, that some of the gospel, at least some of the gospel authors, were actually colorblind. So they couldn't see colors properly. What's the evidence for this? There isn't any, of course. Is this completely ad hoc? Of course it is. Nice and ad hoc, just the way I like it. Right. And then, a crown was, again, something we already mentioned. It was put on the triumphator. Again, if we are thinking about this as a historical fact, would there be a crown of thorns specifically just available in a courtyard of a palace in Jerusalem? I'm not sure. But what's really interesting is that actually there was like crowns in ancient world was a whole thing. Like Romans had specific regulations about different types of crowns and when they were used and for what. And what's interesting is that a specific type of foliage being used had like signified different things. For example, different ranks of awards. So in the Roman army, for example, you could be given a crown as an award for various accomplishments, like a first guy who sieged or scaled the walls of a city during a siege would be awarded a crown, right? And different crowns with different styles essentially were used for different things. So again, here, if you think about it this way, it's not surprising why Jesus is being given a crown of thorns, because it's mocking, right? And also it hurts. But where do you get a crown of thorns actually, like in reality in Jerusalem? Yeah. And Schmidt actually uses an analogy to underline how implausible it is that if these were the actual historical events, there would just be a purple cloak and a crown of thorns available to put on Jesus. He says, imagine we have a story about a death row inmate just being led to execution, and suddenly he is dressed in tuxedo, in a cape, in a top hat, and he's given a cane. Now you might be thinking, okay, why is he being dressed like he's going to the opera specifically, right? This is just wealthy person clothing. He would be specifically dressed appropriately to go to the opera. Why? Right? That's a legitimate question. And the second question is how plausible it is that an inmate would be dressed like that in a prison. Would a tuxedo be available in that situation? So again, not completely impossible, but something to think about. Then we have a verses 18 to 19. So after let's just read it. And they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed and spat upon him and knelt down in homage to him. This is pretty straightforward. Again, after the triumphator was dressed in a robe and a crown, he appeared before his soldiers to receive their praises, essentially. Yeah. So now might be a good idea for to take a look at the chat to see if there are any inciting comments, interesting comments. So if you have any questions or something that you want to say, desperately want to say. By the way, thanks to people who wished me Happy New Year. So Happy New Year to you guys as well. So if there are any questions, then feel free to shoot at me. Otherwise, we'll go on. Yes, indeed, Scott Preston. You should all join the Discord server. There's a Discord server. I don't have anything to do with it, so I don't vouch for what's going on there. But I hear it's a pretty cool place. There is a lot of academic resources available there, so people, linking interesting stuff. So if you enjoy these kinds of conversations and these kinds of streams, then definitely go there. And every once in a while, usually after a stream, there's an after party. And I met a lot of really interesting people there. Not only, but for example, I spoke to Nathan from the Digital Noses there for the first time as well. I had a conversation with Alex, who appeared on Digital Noses for a couple of times as well. He's a really interesting guy who does process philosophy, which is something that I have no idea about. I don't know what it is, but it sounds super interesting. Roman asked, do you know if Cam is going to join this year? Yeah, actually, I don't know. I'm not really in contact with him, to be honest, because he's not on social media. He's, I guess, taking a break from social media, which I absolutely endorse. And I actually haven't had a chance to watch that Nathan's Nathan's New Year's hangout. I'm saving it for a special AMSR occasion where I need to be lulled to sleep by Rob Rowe from Sentinel Apologetics. There just hasn't been an opportunity for that, so I don't actually know what comes said. We'll see. He might show up at any moment unexpectedly. I think it would be absolutely great. But if he doesn't want to do it now, that's fine. This channel will always be here, and I will make sure to save a spot for him. Absolutely. The stream was scheduled way in advance if Doug felt like not overlapping with it. Yeah, well, I mean, Doug's gonna do what Doug's gonna do, right? I'm not particularly bothered by that because, if I don't get live viewers, I'm going to get them within 44 hours because, most people actually watch it anyway. At least most of the subscribers are watching it anyway, sooner or later. So yeah, it would be better to have more people live because you guys can ask questions and comments and stuff like that. But that's all right. Yeah. There's also an anti-triumph in Philos Flaccus. Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know about it, and Schmidt doesn't know about it. It's really interesting. Like, I don't know that much about Roman triumph specifically, but like just reading the article, there was a couple of things that I thought would be interesting for him to mention, but he doesn't. So either it just cut out, or he's not aware of it. Interesting. I thought Pretoria was a region of the camp or legion base near where the general accommodation was located. Yeah, that's true. There was a praetorium in a Roman camp, military camp, because of course Romans, being Romans, had everything perfectly organized. So like a Roman camp was basically a small city where everything was had the specific like place. So every soldier, when a camp was being constructed, knew where his tent, or I should say, tent of him and 7 other soldiers is going to be. And everything was perfectly laid out like a small city. There were roads, there were forums, and stuff like that. I'm not just talking about permanent camps, which were essentially cities. I'm just talking about camps that the Roman army set up just for one night when they were campaigning in like a hostile territory. And there, of course, was Praetorium, right? But then, the term became a term for a specific part of just any military installation, essentially, if you can use that word in the ancient context. So is 2 Corinthians 12, is 2 Corinthians 2:14 sufficient to demonstrate any historical basis? Yeah, probably not. But still, I think it's interesting. Okay, so let's get back to the question in hand, the topic at hand. So let's move on to verse 20. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. Okay. So Jesus gets undressed. This is a point which is inconsistent with the Roman triumph, where, of course, the triumphator was wearing the crown and the robe all the time, all the way up to the culmination of the triumph, which was the sacrificing of the bull and the epiphany of the god. But it's pretty clear why this is in the Gospels, right? Like where here the author breaks from depicting a Roman triumph, and it's because he needs to set up the division of clothing in verse 24, which is an obvious allusion to the Old Testament, specifically to Psalm 22. I think it's verse 18, something like that. So yeah, doesn't work 100%. If it doesn't work, there's usually a reason for it. Okay, then verses 21 to 22. They compelled a passerby who was coming from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. So this is super interesting for a number of reasons, right? So the verb that is used for they brought him is phero, which is commonly used to denote like a procession accompanying a key figure, being accompanied by others, for example, in Luke, John, or the book of Acts. And in Mark, in the Gospel of Mark, the author actually uses a different verb when he talks about just Jesus's transportation, right? He uses apago, which has like a similar meaning but slightly different connotation. And Schmidt thinks that this might be an allusion to the triumphator being carried on a chariot, specifically in a kuro seat. And again, he doesn't have Jesus being carried to Golgotha or on a chariot because that would be just silly, right? Like that would be pushing it maybe a little bit too far. But the argument is, or the idea is, that he's at least alluding to it by depicting, by using this specific word that has these specific connotations. Then we have, of course, Simon carrying the cross, about which much ink has been spilled. There are all kinds of ideas, hypotheses about that, and about why he's described as the father of Alexander and Rufus. Here, Schmidt does something or suggests something which I think is a stretch, right? So during the triumph, there was an official walking alongside the triumphator who was carrying a double-bladed axe that was then used to kill the sacrificial bull. And it was very widely known that crucifixion victims were actually required to wear their own crosses. This is all over the primary literature on crucifixion. That was actually a part of the humiliation, right? That they are essentially like you're digging your own grave, so to speak, by carrying your own cross. So supposedly, for the author of the Gospel of Mark, it wouldn't be plausible to depict someone else carrying Jesus's execution instrument the whole time, because that would just break with historical reality and with what how crucifixions were normally depicted. So the idea is that the cross being carried at least some of the way by someone else was like a compromise that allowed again the author create this allusion to a Roman triumph, but not to break with what would be plausible, like a historical reality, right? And then we, of course, have the question of Golgotha, which again is something that the author of the Gospel of Mark specifically translates, which he doesn't do that often. And it's more literally translated as the place of the head, more specifically of dead man's head. And in Hebrew and in Greek, it has a much more broader meaning. It doesn't just mean like an empty skull, it means just a head, right? The reason why this is translated as a skull in English, Schmidt says, has to do with a specific word that was used in Latin translation in Vulgate, in Jerome's Vulgate, right? And that like skewed essentially translations to other languages for thousands of years, right? At least hundreds of years. And that's why in English, the translation of a skull was used and not just a head. So this could be, again, an allusion to the triumph, even though this might be a little bit of a stretch. For example, Dionysius of Halicarnassus records that there was a head, human head, found on the Capitoline Hill when a temple was constructed. And of course, the Capitoline Hill was the place where the triumph culminated, where the sacrificial bull was killed, and where the epiphany of the god took place. So Dionysius says the soothsayer, so, they were they were laying foundations for a temple. They found a human head, which of course must have been divine omen, right? Because everything was a divine omen. So they called it soothsayer, which is what you would normally do, right? So the soothsayer, accordingly, finding it impossible for him either to impose upon the man or to appropriate the omen, said to them, Romans, tell your fellow citizens, it is ordained by fate that the place in which you found the head shall be the head of all of Italy. Since that time, the place is called the Capitoline Hill from the head that it was found there, and the Romans call heads Capita. So that's the explanation. Dionysius, of course, is writing in Greek, so he needs to explain because a Greek reader who doesn't know Latin wouldn't get it. So we have in both stories we have a hill that's named after a head, Golgotha, and the Capitoline Hill. So that's interesting, right? And then we have verses 23 and 24, which say, "And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he didn't take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothing among them, casting lots to decide what they should take." So here what's really interesting is that Jesus is offered wine mixed with myrrh, but he refuses it. And the triumphator, of course, again was offered was offered wine. What's really interesting is wine mixed with myrrh in the ancient world was a delicacy. This is mentioned, for example, by Pliny the Elder. Some people think that this is meant as a sedative, but this is actually not attested in the ancient sources. Wine mixed with vinegar was a sedative, but that's not in the Gospel of Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is given wine mixed with myrrh. And this is significant because, again, just like the robe and the cloak, this is something that, historically speaking, would be very difficult. It's very implausible that it would be the case, right? Like, why would a crucified criminal be given like a delicacy, a very expensive item to drink? Again, not absolutely impossible, but I would say it's somewhat implausible. But it would make sense on the hypothesis that this is constructed as a Roman triumph because this is what a triumphator is also given, and because he's a triumphator, he would be given this luxury wine laced with myrrh, right? And again, it could be the case that the author of the Gospel of Matthew actually realized that this is an implausibility, historically speaking, so he changed it into wine mixed with gall, which is chlore. I don't know if you know what gall means in English. I don't. I had to look it up. But yeah, this is chlore. This is bile essentially. So here we have the two chapters back to back. I'm not actually sure how apologists are treating it, whether they are treating it as a contradiction or not, because in both cases you have oinos, wine. But I'm sure they could say that he was like offered 2 drinks and he didn't drink any of it, right? And what's really interesting is that what the author of the Gospel of Matthew depicts is that Jesus is giving something which is very bitter, that you don't want to drink, right? He's definitely not given a luxurious item, like a delicacy. He's given something disgusting, essentially. Wine mixed with gall. But he actually tastes it. And when he tastes it, he would not drink it, right? And I think it's really, really important. And in the Gospel of Mark, it doesn't say that he tasted it. Because if it said that he tasted it, it would break the parallel with the Roman triumph, because it was very important in the Roman triumph that the triumphator was offered the wine, but he didn't actually drink it. That's what was apparently like an important part of the ritual. And what's really, really interesting in the Gospel of Mark, it doesn't say anything about Jesus tasting it. In the Gospel of Mark, it says that because Mark changed the story, I would say. So he has like a different, in the cinematic universe of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus just refuses and doesn't taste it. Universe of the Gospel of Matthew, he's giving a different drink. He tastes it, he finds out that it's bitter, that it's disgusting, and he doesn't taste it. So different authors, different literary intentions, right? Yeah. Okay. So let's move to 25 and 27, and we are almost done, actually. How the time flies when you are having such a good time. So it was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two bandits, one on his right and one on his left. So again, the hour of the crucifixion is just an incidental detail, but it's consistent with the timing of a triumph, right? The titulus, so the charge, um, again, criminals were normally given a titulus. They usually wore it around their neck. Interestingly enough, the Gospel of Mark doesn't say it was it was placed on the cross. That's just in later Gospels. So it could be the case again that in the the cinematic universe of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is actually wearing the titular on his neck. And the reason why you don't see it in artistic depictions is because other authors um, specifically said that it was placed above him on the cross in the case of the Gospel of John, I think. So that's just like an interesting factoid. And here Schmidt, like again, draws like a comparison, a parallel to a Roman triumph, during which placards were carried in the procession announcing accomplishments of the triumphator. Um, they were displayed on the way to the Capitoline Hill, not on the hill. So that would be different, right? But this Schmidt explains this like difference by the strength of the tradition. So he thinks that either it like this idea was too ingrained in what Mark's audience expected that it would be difficult for him to change it, or maybe that even this was actually the case, right? That Jesus, when he was on the cross, had this titulus, so it would be difficult to change it. And here, I think you could even just argue that you could imagine Jesus carrying the titulus all the way, um, all the way up to Golgotha around his neck, maybe. Um, and it just is the case that the author of the Gospel of Mark is mentioning it here. So you don't have to conclude necessarily that the titulus just showed up at the crucifixion site all of the sudden. Like the author mentions it here, he doesn't mention it earlier, but I don't see it as that big of a problem. And lastly, Schmidt is making a point about the two bandits crucified next to Jesus. What's really, really interesting in the Gospel of Mark is that the bandits don't do or say anything. Other Gospel authors, maybe because they thought like this is like a nice opportunity, actually have the bandits do and say stuff, right? But in the Gospel of Mark, they are just mentioned. And what's really interesting is that they are mentioned, and it's specifically stated that one is on his right hand and one is on his left hand. And then of course, the way how this is usually understood is that it's a payoff to the two sons of Zebedee being asked to be seated on the left and right hand side of Jesus. And what actually happens is that they get martyred, which is what the gospel alludes to, right? They drink the cup of the martyrdom, uh, and there are just bandits crucified next to Jesus, which is like a reversal of expectation. Right? But Schmidt actually supplies another idea, which might not be contradictory, right? The two hypotheses are not necessarily in contradiction. It could be the case that the author of the Gospel of Mark just had like several things going on at the same time. That's perfectly plausible, right? And he says that, during the triumph, the triumphator often appeared between two people, either his family members or the two consuls for the given year that were, under the Republic, the two highest ranking officials. And then during the Principate, they lost their factual power, but they were still appointed. So yeah, they would just show up, and there is this underlying imagery of a person in position of power being seated in between and essentially being flanked by two different people. And this is very prominent in ancient literature and in ancient imagery in general. Schmidt just gives one example. In Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus is depicting Abner and Jonathan seated on Saul's left and right hand. So that would be his son and his and a general, right? And what's really interesting about it is that, of course, Antiquities of the Jews would just recount histories of the Jews, and for the older periods, like for example the reign of Saul, the only source is just the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, right? So we can actually compare how Josephus is writing with what's in the Hebrew Bible, and we can see the changes that he's making, and we can kind of construct hypotheses about why he's making these changes. Why is this narrative flexibility present? And what's interesting is that in the underlying biblical text in First Solomon, um, Jonathan is actually standing, and Abner is seated on Saul's side, and it doesn't say which one, right? And Josephus actually changes it so that they are seated on the right and the left side. And this is supposedly showing this like very strong imagery of this specific arrangement of people showing up here as well. And so the idea is that Jesus being crucified between two criminals creates the same kind of arrangement, which again points to a triumph. It's supposed to be a mockery of kingship, but it's actually exalting Jesus, right? And there is then an interesting summary in Schmidt. So this is from the article, which I'm again going to link in the video description. So he's essentially summarizing, like he's creating a summary of a Roman triumph, which works equally well for the Gospel of Mark, right? So this is what you find very often in scholarship that points out these parallels, that the authors are going to summarize it. They are going to create a text which essentially describes both things, right? So Schmidt says, the Praetorians gathered early in the morning to proclaim the triumphator. He is dressed in the triumphal garb, and a crown of laurel is placed on his head. The soldiers then shout in acclamation of his lordship and perform acts of homage to him. They accompany him from the camp through the streets of the city. The sacrificial victim is there in the procession, and alongside walks the official carrying the implement of his coming death. The procession ascends finally to the place of the dead's head, where the sacrifice is to take place. The triumphator is offered the ceremonial wine. He does not drink it, but it is poured on the altar at the moment of the sacrifice. Then, at the moment of being lifted up before the people, at the moment of the sacrifice, again the triumphator is acclaimed as Lord, and his vice-regents appear with him in confirmation of his glory. Following the lead of the soldiers, the people gather with their leaders, and the vice-regents themselves join in acclamation. The epiphany is confirmed by importance by the gods. Truly, this man is the Son of God. So that's the basic idea. Do I buy this? This is really interesting question, right? So am I actually convinced by it? Like, do I really think that if we could travel back in time and talk to the author of the Gospel of Mark and ask him what's going on, right? That he would really say, yes, this is my authorial intention. You cracked the code and you have the spiritual discernment. I'm not sure. I think this is really interesting stuff. But again, with these kinds of parallels, it's very difficult to evaluate it, right? I don't think that there is a very good methodology for evaluating it yet, and that there might be some issues with how this is evaluated. So it's always suggested as a hypothesis. Then the author lays these parallels, and the conclusion is kind of left hanging in the air, and it's not really clear what exactly we should observe for us to be confident that this is actually what's going on, right? Like what level of similarity is reasonable for us to conclude that this is going on. And more often than not, it actually turns out that nobody is persuaded by it, right? Like if you read through secondary New Testament literature, you will find different scholars essentially coming up with all these kinds of things all the time. But it doesn't really seem to move a lot of people in either direction. And especially when I find it relatively convincing, I kind of suspend judgment because I want to see, what other people are going to say about it, how it's going to be treated, if there is going to be any follow-up in literature and stuff like that. And to conclude, there is a really interesting point that Schmidt makes that I want to emphasize. So Schmidt thinks that the Gospel of Mark was written in Rome, and he specifically says that it could be written during or shortly after the Neronian persecution of Christians, right, which would be in 60s. And he even thinks, and if you are a Christian listening to it, this is going to completely blow your mind. He thinks that the reason why Simon of Cyrene is introduced as the father of Alexander and Rufus, who, first of all, are never mentioned again before or after. They are not part of the Gospels. They are just like people used to identify who this person is. It's a very weird way how to identify a person, because normally in the ancient world you would identify someone as a son of someone, not as a father of someone. And of course, he's already identified as a Simon of Cyrene, right? So normally this would be sufficient, probably. So Schmidt thinks that the reason why he is identified in this particular way is because these figures, Rufus and Alexandra, were known to Mark's audience in Rome as church figures. And again, this has been discussed to death in secondary literature. The names show up in Pauline letters, both authentic, like Romans, and forgeries, First and Second Timothy. So could be the case that there were people actually in the Christian community in Rome, and they were just known as religious figures, right? And it was known that their father was Simon of Cyrene. That's the idea. So this is what Schmidt thinks, right? He thinks that it was written in Rome. He thinks that it was written in 60s, or at least he says that this is like a possibility. And more importantly, he seems to think that specific people who are mentioned in the Gospel of Mark would be known to Mark's original audience, right? But he still suggests that this entire section of the Passion narrative didn't actually happen in history the way how it's narrated, and that the author of the Gospel of Mark essentially invented it, basically completely, right? Of course, given that there was an underlying event that he's describing, right? But he just completely changed the way how it went. And what's important is that still Schmidt, at least implicitly, thinks that Mark's original audience would be okay with it. So you know how Christian apologists always say that if the gospel authors lied, there would be witnesses around who could call them out, who could essentially set the record straight, right? Who could debunk them. So that's why the conspiracy hypothesis, among other reasons, is not very plausible. Well, here we have a New Testament scholar who thinks that the Gospel of Mark was written specifically for an audience who would have familiarity with people whose father was depicted as being personally present during the crucifixion, actually carrying Jesus's cross, right? And this audience is essentially given a gospel which completely changes the story, right? And the author actually invents an entire narrative specifically to make a point, to compare Jesus' crucifixion with a Roman triumph. And the audience would be okay with it. This is really interesting, right? So this kind of supports, I would say, my idea of this underlying idea of narrative flexibility, right? The idea that the gospel authors were not free to change anything or to engage within their like own original literary creation, because immediately Christians who knew better would be screaming bloody murder is just ridiculous, right? Like, of course, there was narrative flexibility. And even if they were potentially people who had access to eyewitnesses, like their father, who plausibly would be telling their sons stories about how Jesus was executed if he really was there, right? Um, so the idea that there were people around, it really isn't an issue because they would understand this is what's going on and they would be okay with it. And that there are several reasons for this, and there are several like examples that we can give in the ancient world where this is going on. And I just find it interesting that here we have a New Testament scholar who, at least implicitly, seems to agree that he doesn't really see any problem with Rufus and Alexander either being there, who supposedly their father himself witnessed the crucifixion, or the audience member of the Gospel of Mark knew about him, so they maybe heard the story from them, right? That's how the oral tradition circulated. But then they were given this gospel who depicted events differently because the author had this specific literary intention, and it apparently didn't harm popularity of the Gospel of Mark because otherwise it wouldn't be in the canon, right? It was probably one of the more popular, if not one of the most popular Gospels in circulation, I think for a good reason. Um, so yeah, that's really interesting. Like if you are a Christian apologist, then I think you should take this to heart and repent of your sins against the historical method. Cool. So, any questions? Yeah, Antikythera says, I really like the tie with the triumph of Vespasian, which helps with the dating. Yeah, it's really interesting. What I would love to do, that could be an interesting exercise, is to just go through, write down on a timeline individual triumphs when they took place. Because during the Principate, the triumphs, I would say, were not super often, just because like the nature of the triumph and their its specifically like function changed. So I suspect there wouldn't be that many triumphs going on. The last one before would be staged by Nero. And if they were very infrequent, I think it would raise the plausibility that actually, like the Gospel of Mark was written with like one specific triumph in mind, and that would be the triumph of Vespasian, which was supposedly very bombastic, right? It wasn't just about him squashing a rebellion in Judea, it was also about him and his sons defeating that particular rebellion because it was extremely dangerous, actually, and Romans really had to invest a lot of manpower and resources into crushing it. It wasn't just like your typical, rebellion. And of course, it was like the part of the whole situation was actually Vespasian becoming an emperor. So it didn't just celebrate his military victory; it actually celebrated his ascent to power. So yeah, you could argue that maybe the Gospel of Mark is engaging specifically with that piece of like the imperial propaganda. I find it really, really interesting idea. So yeah, so unless you have any other questions, nice pencil by the way. Yeah, thanks. It's getting shorter by like a centimeter every day because I'm studying for my Greek exams next week, and it's very, very difficult. Uh, so I have to write down a lot of stuff like Greek verbs and declensions and stuff like that. So yeah, unless you have anything else, let's talk about something completely different. And here I just found out this, which I find really interesting. It's just how casually do you find someone like Jesus in ancient history, right? So Jesus wasn't really special in any way in my estimation. Um, and yeah, like it happens all the time that you are reading through ancient sources and you just find out there was a guy who shares some similarity to Jesus, and there you go. It's just like a footnote in history. Nobody really talks about it. He has a stop on Wikipedia, but no big deal, right? I think this would be exactly what happened to Jesus. What would happen to Jesus if Christianity didn't become popular? Uh, but here we have some examples, right? So this is Tacitus writing about history, and this is really interesting because it's talks about a guy who is a Boyan, so from Boi, that was a Celtic tribe, who in this specific period of time was living where I live, actually, here in the Czech Republic, and of course, Czechia in Latin is Bohemia, which is derived from the name Boi. Boi were, of course, Celtic people. Um, one Celtic oppidum, like one Celtic city, is nearby Prague. Actually, it's one of the largest, where like 10% of the entire population of the country live at one point. Actually, um, and you can go there. There are like cool things to see and do there. Of course, then the Slavs moved, and well, first the Germans, but then the Slavs moved and ruined all the fun that the Celts were having. But yeah, I just find it really interesting that apparently here or here-ish, there was or at least a guy who descended from people living here, uh, shared some similarities to Jesus, so you can put him down on the list of people around the first century who shared similarities to Jesus and who, hey, apparently actually existed in history. So Tacitus says, amid the adventures of these illustrious men, one is ashamed to relate how a certain Maricus, a Boyan of the lowest origin, pretending to divine inspiration, ventured to thrust himself into fortune's game and to challenge the arms of Rome, calling himself the champion of Gaul and a god, for he has assumed this title. He had collected 8,000 men and was taking possession of the neighboring villages of the Edui, just a Gallic tribe. I think they are actually playable in in not in Total War per se, but there is this expansion, like a mod, essentially total conversion, called Europa Barbarorum, where the Gauls are split into two sections, the Arveni and the Edui, if I'm not mistaken. Someone would have to check that. It's been a while since I played that. Um, and by the way, that mod is way better than the base game. It's insanely difficult, but it's specifically created to be historically accurate. So like the tech tree and all of the units and their skins and stuff like that are way more historically accurate. Like you don't have Bronze Age Egypt in the 3rd century as you do in uh, the base game. And for example, all of the descriptions of buildings and units are in the original languages, which for like the Bactrians, well, actually the Bactrians would be in Greek, right? But like for example, the Parthians, or for the various Gallic and Germanic people, that's a massive accomplishment, right? So by the way, so anyway, the villages of the Edui. What the most formidable state When the most formidable state, so that would be the Roman, attacked him with a picked force of its native young, to which Vitellius attached some cohorts, and dispersed the crowd of fanatics. Maricus was captured in the engagement and was soon after exposed to wild beasts, but not having been torn by them, was believed by the senseless multitude to be invulnerable. So this is actually amazing, right? So he was fed to beasts, but he didn't die, so surely he must have been a god. How do you explain that, atheists? You just don't survive being fed to the beasts. Romans were very very, very good when it comes to crucifying people, right? They always make sure that the person who was being crucified died. So similarly, they must have been proficient when it comes to feeding people to wild beasts. So this best explained by him actually being a god, right? You can't explain it on naturalism and on like materialistic atheism. So checkmate. But then, I don't know, until he was put to death in the presence of Vitellius. So, to-do-dum-dum. But yeah, I mean, I find it super cool. And just imagine if we have if we had 4 gospels written about this guy and a couple of letters, by his followers, I think that was really cool. But unfortunately, he probably made the mistake of going after the Romans militarily. So if he kind of laid low and was preaching, and his followers were preaching and they were evangelizing people, and if his religion was actually monotheistic, and if it was very egalitarian and open to everyone, including women and slaves, Gentile and Hebrew, and if his religion was also had an afterlife with like heaven and hell, with rewards and punishments, divine justice and stuff like that. Then I think we would actually all be talking about. I already forgot what his name is. Yeah, such a poor guy. Um, we would be essentially talking about him, right? And I guess instead of crosses, we would have like a picture of a wild, like an icon of a wild beast, right, on churches and stuff like that. But such is history. So, any last comments in the chat? I don't think so. Hopefully, you guys can still hear me, but it seems everything is okay. So, thank you guys for your attention. If you found this interesting, subscribe if you're not subscribed already. Comment. Just just tell me that you enjoyed it, right? Like, if you enjoy this, do tell me, because first of all, that makes me feel good, but also, if there are lots of comments under a video, then that just helps with the YouTube algorithm. And if you like the channel, spread the word, share it, maybe on social media, in various groups that I'm sure you are all members of. Just drop that video and tell people to watch it. And I'll see you guys next time.